Yeah, thanks so much, Aisha. Yeah, and thank you to everybody that's here in person, and thanks to everybody that's tuning in online. Greatly appreciate it. My name is Gabriel Rincon. I'm a third-year law student here at the UBC Faculty of Law. Before we kick things off, I just wanted to recognize the immense privilege that I have to study, live, and be presenting from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. So today I'm going to be talking about freedom of religion in a plural society, but really going to be focusing on MAID, or Medical Assistance in Dying here in Canada. This is basically a talk I cobbled together on based on a directed research project that I did with a professor at the faculty, Bruce McDougall. So Bruce, thank you so much for your help if you're tuning in online. He was really invaluable in guidance, mentorship, and really learning and legal knowledge to help me produce this work. So basically, I've really always been sort of fascinated by how we deal with competing philosophies in a plural society and how we essentially agree to all disagree but politely live together. And one of those situations when there's just an immense collision course of philosophies is medical assistance in dying. So it's just a fantastic case study that brings up some really compelling and important legal issues. So today I just move on to the next slide here. This is what I plan to talk about today. I really hope that towards the end maybe we can have a bit of a discussion. I'm not sure if people online can participate in any way, but yeah, if folks somehow want to participate and have a discussion, disagree with me, that'd be fantastic. So first of all, I'll tell you why all of this matters, so I won't make you wait and hear me drone on for 2 hours before I get to the actual meat and potatoes of why this is important. Then I'm also going to touch on, yeah, of course, so we recognize we have religious freedom, but why? Why do we recognize that? What are the principles and the purposes of it? What has the Supreme Court said on this subject? I'm in law, so that's naturally a big point of my research. And then to really get to what I think is going to be, what I really hope to contribute to the literature is, how can we set principled limits on freedom of religion? What are sort of the boundaries of these rights in Canada, and how can we balance them with other competing interests of other folks? And then at the end, while you're all here, how does this all relate to MAID? So to start off with, well, why do we care? Why does any of this all matter? So medical assistance in dying in Canada is now legal. It's a publicly provided healthcare service, and it's available in public hospitals. In Canada, we have a public healthcare system, and MAID is one of the many services that are provided, that's provided publicly. However, in Canada, we have this sort of unique system and cooperation where we have hospitals that are actually run by faith-based organizations. One such hospital is St. Paul's Hospital, downtown here in Vancouver. I'm going to be referring back to St. Paul's Hospital. I'm not trying to pick on them. They're just a good example that's poignant and relevant to the local community. And a lot of also religious people of faith that are doctors are refusing to provide MAID because of their religious convictions. However, the flip side of this is that the folks that are looking for access to MAID are among the most vulnerable individuals in our society. They're going through immense debilitating conditions. And this obviously, the refusal to provide MAID at hospitals and by doctors can cause these folks immense hardship. So that's really the two sides of what's at stake. And my research question is essentially, how do we reconcile these sort of competing interests? What sort of bounds can we draw around freedom of religion? What kind of bounds can we draw around the interests of patients, and how the heck do we reconcile these? Because at the end of the day, we live in a plural society where these interests have to coexist and have to be properly heard and balanced. So this goes to the question of, well, why do we have religious freedom, and what's it all about? Well, the easy question is, well, because the Constitution says so. Right here, it tells us everyone has the following fundamental freedoms: freedom of conscience and religion. Great, so that's really helpful, Canada, thanks. But what the heck does that mean? So really, this sets out that we have freedom of religion, but we're not really certain as to what the content of this freedom is. So a lot of that thing comes down to the courts to tell us what this actually means and draw the boundaries of it. But more deeply than that, it actually goes to a question of, well, what's the law on this subject? Well, we have the written law here that says we have freedom of religion. But what about the principles that underlie that and the principles in which the Canadian legal system exists, which is, well, frankly, Western liberal philosophy? So that was my starting point. I looked to what are the scholars saying in this field. Why do they say we have freedom of religion? So this is our good friend, Professor John Rawls. He's a big scholar in political philosophy and legal philosophy as well. And essentially why he says that we have freedom of religion, or his theory of liberal pluralism, is that there's no one conception of the good life. Essentially, if we live in a liberal society, we have to accept that what we believe our purpose in life is not going to be the same as our neighbors. And we don't know which one of us is correct, so we essentially tolerate each other's beliefs and agree to live peacefully in a society where individuals are free to pursue their own aims. So I let my neighbor go off and do their thing, and I'm expecting them to reciprocate and give me the same liberty to go pursue my own conception of the good life. So this is essentially the agreement that we came to after a long history of religious violence, especially in Western Europe in the Enlightenment period. And we came to this sort of philosophy as to, okay, we let people pursue their own vision of the good life because none of us can really claim to be right about what the purpose of human life is. So the plural liberal society is essentially set up to allow individuals to pursue their own aims. And crucially, well, we have to think about the law as well. Everybody else is exercising their democratic power to try to limit what I'm doing. But when that's done, when a law says you do X or you cannot do X, it has to do so without appealing to transcendental values. So what I mean by that is it has to appeal to values that we can generally all agree upon. We don't have to appeal to particular religious philosophy to justify why the law is what it is. So clearly, there's more than just the charter at work here. Religious freedom is really rooted in a respect for human dignity and liberty. And what the charter is doing is enshrining these principles in Canadian law. And the reason I have these two cases up here is because these principles of religious freedom existed in Canadian law without needing to appeal to the charter. So we have a case, Drummond-Wren, decided about 30 years before the charter. But essentially it said, in the olden days, you could restrict who your parcel of land was sold to even after you died. And one such covenant to restrict the sale of that land said, well, you can't sell it to, quote unquote, Jews or persons of objectionable nationality. So that's clearly repugnant. And the court said, you know what, this is repugnant, we're not going to help you enforce this because we accept that we live in a plural society that embraces religious freedom. So get out of here. And another one, maybe this is like the classic case when we think about like the thought experiment on religious freedom, which is a Jehovah's Witness individual was able to sue their doctor after, despite saving their life, they gave him a blood transfusion. And the court said, well, you knew he was a Jehovah's Witness. He has the bodily autonomy and religious freedom to decide what to do with his own body. So doctor, by performing that operation on him, you battered him, you committed a tort. You intruded on his bodily autonomy, and that's bad. So again, the court does not need to appeal to the charter, rather these principles already sort of existed in Canadian law and Canadian society. However, there's got to be limits to this, so liberties can't be unbounded. But why? So, well, for one, the charter says they can't be unbounded. All of our Section 2A rights to religious freedom are bounded by reasonable limits because Section 1 of the charter says so. So essentially, when the court finds that there has been a violation of somebody's religious freedoms, then they go to what's called a Section 1 analysis to see if it was reasonable or not. The other reason, of course, is, well, yeah, we can tolerate a lot of beliefs, but at what point does it actually start to look like we're tolerating intolerance, and does our society start to become intolerant rather than tolerant? So where is this line? I just really love this quote. This is former Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Wilson. And she says, in a landmark case, Morgenthaler, relating to abortion, the rights guaranteed by the Charter erect around each individual, metaphorically speaking, an invisible fence over which the state will not be allowed to trespass. The role of the courts is to map out, piece by piece, the parameters of the fence. I just love that because it really captures what I'm trying to get across here, that around every individual, there's a bubble or a fence of rights where other individuals can't intrude. So what you do within that is really up to you. But it's not boundless, it's fenced in, and it's up to the courts to determine what the scope of that fence is. So what has the Supreme Court said? What is the scope of this fence? So there's a number of really seminal cases in this space, the biggest one being one called Big M Drug Mart, and it's relating to the Lord's Day Act, where formerly in Canada you couldn't operate your business on Sundays because you had to observe the Lord's Day, so you had to rest on Sunday. So it was illegal to operate your business on Sundays because of that. So what does the Constitution say? Let's recall. It says everybody has freedom of religion. Okay. So what does that mean in the context of this case? And Chief Justice Dixon at the time went through I think, a really masterful analysis, and he said, well, that means that you have the freedom to believe, but it also means freedom from belief. You cannot compel adherence to a particular belief through the use of the law. So it was pretty easy to say here, you know what, there's a very blatant religious purpose. It's called the Lord's Day Act. So you can't really compel individuals to do that. So that's our starting point. And then the case law developed from there. So we have Anselm, which concerned, there's a Montreal condo and a number of Jewish residents wanted to build sukkahs on their balcony, which is a sort of structure important to a Jewish religious holiday. And basically the condo association said no. So it was up to the courts to determine, well, should they be allowed to build sukkahs on their balconies? And they said, well, Section 2A says you have religious freedom, and we're not going to sort of investigate the content of your beliefs. It's not for the court to determine matters of theology. Rather, if you have a sincerely held belief with some sort of nexus with religion, you're going to be covered by the Charter. And this is really important because it really says the courts aren't in the business of determining what's a legitimate belief and what's illegitimate. So that's out of the hands of the state. It's not our business. So again, accepting a really broad scope for pluralism in Canada. And the last one here that I have up here is Sanguinier, because it sets out another important principle in Canadian law, which is state neutrality. So there was another town in Quebec that started off at town hall meetings with a Catholic prayer. An atheist attendant at town hall didn't like this very much, so he sued, and the court said, yeah, you know what, this is illegal, because by professing a Catholic prayer, the state is signaling that, you know what, we adhere more closely to Catholic beliefs than other beliefs. And this doesn't really adhere to the values of pluralism, where everybody should feel welcome in a democratic state and like their beliefs are being heard and like the government will be accepting of their beliefs. So again, from everybody has freedom of religion, the court determined that this means that the state must also respect religious neutrality. So in reading all these cases, I'll spare everybody all the reading I did and just briefly summarize it, that a lot of these cases came down to there is a religious entity or religious individual bringing a claim to the court because they wanted the law to accept their particular belief. So, can I build a sukkah on my balcony? So at the end of the day, what the court was trying to answer was, does accepting or rejecting this belief in Canadian law further pluralism? And a lot of the times the justices disagreed, so you would have a majority opinion and a dissenting opinion where one set of justices said, yeah, you know what, if we accept this belief, we're furthering pluralism. And then the dissent said, no, we have to reject this belief to further pluralism. So the answer is both? Like, how can that be? That really boggled my mind. I was having a really hard time finding what are really the principles here? What are we trying to pull on? Because, well, not both sides can be right. So how can we really create sort of principle limits? What principles are we drawing on to say, you know what, this furthers pluralism, or you know what, accepting this belief does not actually further pluralism? And again, I'll spare everybody all the reading I did, but what I came to was what I called sort of rejection criteria. So these are indicia that I think will help courts identify which beliefs, if accepted, would actually further pluralism. So what I mean by that is I've combed through a lot of philosophy on this point and a lot of what the courts have said on this point and tried to pull out threads as to what the courts were really trying to get at when they accepted or rejected a particular belief. And I came to coercion. So it's one thing to say, I believe X. It's a very different thing to say, I believe X, therefore other folks should believe it. Then the nature of the law that's being tried to impose on others, it becomes coercive because we don't all agree on the same bases. So if a particular belief is trying to be imposed on other folks, that has a coercive element that generally courts should try to avoid, in my opinion. So this goes back to the fact that, well, public power must be independently justifiable. So we have to be able to point to things that we can all generally agree on when we're justifying the reason for a law. And more simply, the court has said, well, the freedom to believe is far broader than the freedom to act on those beliefs. So that's what I was trying to get at with this coercion rejection criteria. So if somebody comes to the court and what they're actually trying to do is have a coercive belief imposed on others, the court should be more scrutinous of this sort of claim. And the last one is that the trouble I was having is that a lot of the claims that were being brought to the court were actually had this sort of like internal hypocrisy of, we're asking society to tolerate us, but the actual belief that we're asking to be tolerated doesn't respect the liberty that we're asking for, but we don't believe that other folks should have. So this is a thread that runs through a lot of the claims that we're going to be talking about today with MAID, and I just thought it was, the courts never have really quite said this. They've sort of alluded to this, and I thought it would be far clearer if they actually pointed and put their finger on it and you said, you know what? This belief doesn't actually further pluralism because of this. It's actually a blatantly intolerant belief, and you don't actually believe that other folks should have the same liberty that you're asking for yourself. So finally, what is it, 4 hours now? We got to finally why you're all here. How does this all relate to MAID? So as I alluded to at the very beginning, there's a lot of freedom of religion claims surrounding MAID, and they have a really deep impact on folks on both sides. So the hospitals, the doctors, other healthcare practitioners, as well as patients. So really the questions that I was trying to grapple with were, can the law require doctors to help patients access MAID? This is a very real question that's being asked right now in Canada. And it deserves a legitimate answer because doctors are raising religious objections to providing MAID, and they're even, in some cases, unwilling to refer patients to non-objecting doctors. So a lot of this is based on the theory that these doctors believe that medical assistance in dying is objectionable or sinful in some way, and they simply don't want to be associated with these sorts of actions. And then on the other side, we also have hospitals. So we're calling back to St. Paul's. They, for example, refuse to provide assessments for MAID as well as MAID on their premises. So even if you have a doctor that's non-objecting, that's treating a patient that's housed at St. Paul's, they wouldn't be able to be assessed for MAID, and MAID wouldn't be able to be performed at St. Paul's Hospital, despite it being a publicly funded hospital providing public services. So that's there's a little allusion to where I might go with this. And of course, we have to remember what's at stake here. So the other side of the coin is, well, we have individuals that are really suffering. So this is Mr. Ian Shearer. I'm sharing his story because it's part of the public record. The news covered his story, and it's quite tragic. So he was a former patient at St. Paul's, and, well, he was denied MAID. He was suffering from a number of debilitating conditions. He was eligible for MAID. He ultimately received MAID in another facility, but before that he had to undergo an extremely gruesome and horrible transfer because, well, these folks are suffering. They're really in a very weak and unstable condition, and to move them to another facility really causes unbelievable amounts of hardship. And unfortunately, Mr. Shearer had to go through one of these transfers, and yeah, so this is really the human element of everything we're talking about here. So this has been very academic, but I thought it was important to show that this has a very human element and a very human cost. So let's get to the question about doctors. So can doctors be required to help patients access MAID? And if any of you encounter lawyers in the future, you'll hear this answer a lot. Well, it depends. And in this case, it really depends on what province you're in. So in Quebec and Alberta, if your physician essentially objects to even providing a referral or performing MAID, there's a central referral system that the government provides where patients can then be triaged and access MAID in other places. Ontario has gone a different route, though. It actually requires individual physicians to provide an effective referral in good faith. And on this point, we actually have a case. So the Christian Medical and Dental Society of Ontario sued and said, you know what? Our doctors object to even referring patients to non-objecting physicians because they believe that that's against their faith, and they don't want to be complicit in this, what they believe is this unlawful act. So at the end of the day, the court, what they said is, yeah, you know what, there's a legitimate freedom of religion claim here. By requiring this, the government is infringing on your charter rights. But again, we have to recall that Section 1 says, well, is this a reasonable limit? So it comes down, as we might expect, to the balancing of the freedom of religion of doctors, as well as the interests of patients. And then I want to go back to my rejection criteria here, because I think it's a good way to frame the decision, despite the court not actually using the terms. So the court found that actually, you know what, this claim by the doctors, it's not just a mere belief, it's more than that. It's actually has a coercive element because doctors can't impose the costs of their beliefs onto their patients because of the function that doctors play in the Canadian healthcare society, Canadian healthcare provision. They're essentially gatekeepers to the public healthcare system. And because they're doctors, they owe a fiduciary duty. So that means essentially they have to put the patient's interests above theirs. So what this means is that if the doctor, because of their beliefs, has to undergo some costs, so adjust their practice so that they're not the ones directly referring patients, then that's a cost that they should bear and that should not be imposed on patients. I think that the court was also pointing at the fact that, you know what, this belief is actually, you're asking us to tolerate this religious conviction, but you're not actually respecting the liberty that your patients are showing, that your patients are trying to exercise. So by refusing to refer somebody to a non-objecting physician, you're actually stigmatizing your own patients. And it allows doctors sort of a platform to moralize and question the liberty of their patients, and that's really not the purpose of the public provision of healthcare. So essentially, in Ontario, doctors have to give referrals to non-objecting physicians. The question with hospitals, though, is way more thorny than this, and it's actually really fascinating because the courts have been silent on this, and the legislatures are silent on this, and it's not a huge issue, but I think it's a really important one for Canadian society to grapple with. Is it legal for faith-influenced hospitals to refuse to provide MAID? We don't know. Do hospitals even have freedom of religion? We don't know. So quite exciting in terms of a research topic to speak on, mostly because, well, at least my research didn't reveal any court cases on this, there's scholarship surrounding this, but I couldn't quite find a paper on this topic. And then from my research, what I'm concluding is that, well, no, actually. So faith-influenced hospitals cannot legally refuse to provide MAID precisely because I don't think that they have a valid freedom of religion claim, because they're hospitals. So a little bit on what the Constitution and what the courts have said the Constitution requires of hospitals. So the courts have said, hospitals, you might be some sort of private entity, you might be actually controlled by some sort of faith group, But really, for the provision of healthcare services, you are, for all intents and purposes, the government. So when you're providing healthcare, you have to adhere to the charter. They said this in the context of providing healthcare services to folks with disabilities. But again, the principle, I believe, stands here. Because the underlying idea here is that the government has to adhere to the charter, so they can't essentially skirt those responsibilities by outsourcing the provision of a public service to a private body. So the courts have just said, you know what, that private body, for all intents and purposes, is either the government's agent or it just simply is the government. And we know from our case law, well, the government can't profess a religious belief. It can't say, we're Catholic, so we're refusing to perform the service, because that violates the duty of state neutrality. Therefore, a hospital, I believe, can't have religious beliefs as such because it's the government. It can't profess a particular religious belief over others. And then we get to another interesting issue where there's not that much certainty in the case law is, well, a hospital is brick and mortar, it's a building. How can it have religious beliefs? So there's been a little bit of case law on this in terms of there's been some Supreme Court decisions saying that a corporation with a religious purpose, for example, might have freedom of religion. We're not sure. But in general, when the courts have talked about group claims about freedom of religion, they've just basically said there's a group of religious individuals here and each one of them would have a freedom of religion claim. But we're not saying that the institution itself, whether that be a Catholic school or evangelical university, we're not saying that that entity itself has religious freedom. So let's go back to Providence Healthcare, which is sort of the umbrella organization for St. Paul's Hospital. So they're ultimately controlled by the Archdiocese of Vancouver, and they are essentially informed by Catholic traditions and religious principles. However, the actual employees and patients at St. Paul's aren't necessarily Catholic. They're just doctors and patients. So if somebody, God forbid, breaks their leg downtown and they have to get taken to the emergency room, you very might well end up at St. Paul's Hospital. That individual may not be Catholic. That individual isn't there necessarily to commune with other Catholics. They're not there for any sort of religious purpose. They're there to receive what's a publicly funded, publicly available service from an entity that the government has said is the government. That the courts have said is the government. So on these principles, I applied my rejection criteria. So if a hospital were to say, no, you can't require us to provide MAID because of our religious freedom, I would argue that that actually has a large coercive element because it's imposing that belief on patients that don't necessarily share that belief. And we have to recall that this has immense human suffering. It forces some of the most vulnerable individuals in our society to go through immense amounts of pain because they have to be transferred to other places. And then we have to balance that with the counter-argument that's really founding this claim in religious freedom, which is that we as a hospital, so the Archdiocese of Vancouver that runs this hospital doesn't want to provide a venue for MAID because they don't want to be complicit in what they believe is sin. So if we look at the remoteness and sort of put those sort of harms on a balance, it's a little bit tough to see how the hospital could really have a legitimate claim here. But again, I hopefully some folks disagree with me and challenge me on my beliefs and change my mind if possible. On the other hand, is this belief actually intolerant? Does this have like a whiff of internal hypocrisy here? Because I believe that a refusal to provide a venue for MAID denies the liberty of others to make their own health decisions. And we have to remember that MAID is a legal, publicly available healthcare service that's being provided by the government. And folks really have very little choice as to what hospital they end up in, like Mr. Shearer did. So if we allow sort of a religious institution that's administering this hospital to shape how a public service is being provided and create this inequality in how a public healthcare is provided in this country, well, I think that leads to some really discriminatory, intolerant outcomes. So likely one that we should avoid. So despite the courts not having addressed these, I think that there's some really compelling arguments for why hospitals should be required to provide, or at least can't legally deny, the provision of MAID. Yeah. So thank you everybody for sticking with me through all that. Welcome your questions. Hopefully we can spark a discussion here. And yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, you should, please.
That was so interesting. Thank you for that. And
no,
you're
thank you.
Such a great presenter.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Clear. I have maybe kind of a obvious and not great question, but like a thought that I kept having throughout your presentation was like the publicly funded aspect of it. If an entity is receiving like money from people regardless of their religious affiliation, is there some precedent for it to like veto acting in a religiously specific manner because you're funded by and exist because of money from that doesn't come from very specific groups or something like that? Is there something going on there that would be?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and yeah, I definitely thought that would come up. So the answer is not really. So the courts have actually grappled with this issue in the context of, well, publicly funded universities. And they've basically said that it depends on the role. So in what function is a particular body that's receiving public funds acting? And is the government essentially in full control, or what degree of control do they have over that activity? So in the context of these hospitals, for example, well, healthcare is a public service. It's part of a harmonious act that harmonizes healthcare across Canada. So the government has a large degree of control over the provision of healthcare services in hospitals. So for the provision of healthcare services, these hospitals have to adhere to the Constitution as the government would. It becomes a slightly thornier issue in terms of, well, when you're hiring and firing employees, are you acting as the government, right? Well, you're receiving public funds, so you're the government. Hold on a minute, no, because the government doesn't really have that much control over how you administer your employees, so the answer is not really for those purposes. But yeah, no, but it's a really interesting question. I think that's probably the right answer, though, because in some form or another, all individuals, businesses, or entities in Canada receive public funds. So then are we saying, well, we're all the government, we all have to adhere to the Constitution? That's not really the point of the Constitution. It's really to govern the relationship between citizens and the state. Yeah. Yeah, hopefully that answered the question.
I have a follow-up with that.
Sure, yeah. Absolutely.
Maybe I'm just like kind of having trouble understanding it. That was a great explanation though. Like, the money comes in, my understanding is that with something like a centralized healthcare system,
Yeah.
it's like the money is brought in from the public, and then you don't decide where your money goes to. It goes into this pool, and then it goes to these hospitals, right?
Yeah.
So in some sense, because there's no, like, you don't have any agency in whether your money goes to this hospital or that hospital or something like that, doesn't that mean that, like, and like, they are accepting patients of different states, they are accepting employees of different,
Yeah.
so it's interesting, why is it, like, do they have any other, like St. Paul's, for example, are there any other kinds of treatments where they've exercised a similar kind of reasoning, where they refuse to or prefer not to? Like, is there something going on with, like, I don't know, abortions or something like that?
Yeah, actually there's called the Hospital Act in BC, and there's the province explicitly says St. Paul's Hospital does not have to perform abortions or provide abortion services. So they have a legislative exemption, basically, from the provision of abortion services. Yeah, so yeah, it's a tough question because I understand the intuition of, well, we're paying for them, like, and this causes actually a lot of controversy, not just because of Mr. Shearer, but also because they St. Paul's Hospital is being expanded. They're getting a fancy new wing in downtown Vancouver that's being largely funded by the public. So the public there's public outcry. Well, like, they don't want to perform MAID. They're not providing access to abortions, but they're happily receiving our money.
Yeah.
So how does that seem fair? So there's definitely that element there of, well, the public believes this is unjust, but the funding's not really what the courts have used to get to the same sorts of reasons in terms of how healthcare services should be provided. It's not really the funding, but the element of control that the government has over what's being provided. So healthcare is a public service. They just chose to deliver it through hospitals that are these semi-private entities. And that's what the courts have used to reason, rather than the funding element. Yeah, no, I definitely understand the feeling of injustice there.
But
Yeah.
I guess my final follow-up is, so what you said at the end was really interesting, like, they haven't picked up on the funding thread, like that.
Yeah.
Is it that, like, sometimes certain forms of reasoning just, they gain particular momentum? Because there's maybe earlier cases that have kind of used that, and so it just becomes worth following along that, even if it may not maybe like be the best or the most obvious or intuitive explanation?
Yeah, that could definitely be an element of it. Yeah, especially in law, because once there's a precedent established, well...
Can you use that as evidence and say, like, well, they said it in, like, this place in
Yeah.
the U.S. or this place in Ontario for this reason, so we're saying the same thing now?
Yeah, so not necessarily the U.S., like our courts, yeah, really very rarely cite the U.S., but yeah, you can definitely absolutely, and if you're a lawyer and you're going to court to make a novel argument, well, you find maybe the Supreme Court said something in a prior case, and then well, let's point to that. Justice so-and-so said this, and they're a really prominent justice, so Supreme Court said it, hasn't been picked up on yet, but let's explore where that idea might take us. So that's definitely a really prominent element in legal reasoning. I think in this case, though, it's hard to say with funding, because then it becomes sort of a threshold issue. So if you receive 10 cents from the government, does that mean you should essentially be called the government for purposes of the charter? I don't know. If you receive 100% of your funding, well, maybe you have an argument there. So I think the control element, the control that the government has over how you exercise a particular activity, I think might just be a better barometer for what we're trying to capture. Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks for your question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
What about the status of healthcare? Like, can't we argue that healthcare, because it is universally provided thing in Canada, should not, in general, in any form that is provided? Like, you can't have private healthcare. Like, private hospitals in Canada, can you? Like, there's no other category, so wouldn't you, like, de facto have to, like it's already a category that we agree is universal, so, and doesn't have a religious, I don't know if you get where I'm going with this, but, like, if the category is, then should the individual hospital operating within that category also have to?
I mean, yeah, like we agree there that this seems to me pretty black and white. Like, I don't know what sort of really strong argument the hospitals might be able to come up with, if I'm honest. I think that this is a pretty easy charter challenge if somebody wanted to bring it, but I'm not a lawyer, so what do I know? But no, I agree with you, but I guess just to throw this out there, there's another issue, which is a lot of MAID is actually being provided in hospices. And hospices are a particular healthcare service that isn't publicly provided uniformly. So it sort of exists in this sort of legal gray area where I'm not really quite sure what the law would be there. I think that would be a harder charter challenge to bring. So a lot of these hospices are receiving public funds, but they're providing a service that is healthcare, but isn't necessarily publicly provided healthcare. So then you get into some really thorny issues. But no, but I agree with you in terms of, yeah, with MAID and hospitals, in particular hospitals. I don't know what sort of arguments they could bring up. Yeah, I don't know, Jacob, you had your hand up earlier, I don't know.
It's just like a broad question.
Sure.
So in my experience, like, sort of very, very limited experience in all of this, it's almost tough to get these issues into a policy space because of the polarizing nature. Did you find that in your research that, there's very little policy talk
geez.
To a policy phase that we thought about these election cycles and
Yeah, so I think initially what it actually took to legalize, for lack of a better word, MAID in Canada was a Supreme Court challenge. So the courts are actually a really important policy instrument that advocacy groups and individuals can use to bring about the change when we don't have these particularly sort of, there's more compelling things to talk about, like inflation and whatnot, and any other number of regulatory issues. But when you have something that's so narrow, yeah, it's really hard to get a lot of people rally behind it and have it be a big policy issue. So yeah, like a lot of this policy change was brought about by the courts, because in 2015, a charter challenge got up to the courts with somebody saying that, you know what, like, I should be allowed to have MAID. I'm going through immense suffering and the government shouldn't force me to essentially continue living when I've lost all quality of life. And the Supreme Court said, you know what, yeah, that is illegal. So then the government was forced to change the law, and then that started a discussion in the public sphere about it. But it sort of lost that momentum. So I think with a lot of these claims that do end up in the Supreme Court, at the beginning of the huge public change, like, oh my goodness, now MAID is legal in Canada, what happened, what have you. But that's now a few years ago now, so I really don't have very much to any experience in political advocacy, so I really don't know what it would take to bring this back into the limelight. But I don't know, with other very pressing healthcare issues in Canada, especially, well, obviously surrounding COVID, and assisted living centers, and maybe we're going to have to think about how old folks' homes operate, and hospices for that matter. Maybe we can bring it back into the conversation through that sort of avenue. Yeah, that's Steve and then Kayla. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I'm sorry for a few minutes.
No, of course, no worries.
I have like so many questions, so I actually don't even know which one to ask. But can you go back a few slides?
Sure.
I'm wondering if you go back to the one, this one about how can a hospital have religious beliefs?
Yeah.
I thought that was really provocative and interesting. So you're saying, in that case, did I understand right? You're saying, like, how can a hospital, which is like a brick and mortar building, have religious beliefs?
Yeah.
So I guess I would say, though, like, but a hospital isn't a brick and mortar building. Like, a hospital is made up of, just like a corporation is made up of people, right? Or a university, like. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, I guess this brought me two questions. Was, have you thought of, like, have you thought of that, or has that come to you like a counter to that?
Yeah.
And then the part B I was thinking about was, like, could you have a hospital without people? And I was thinking about, like, with AI developments.
Oh, yeah.
Where we have more and more AI, like, they're trying to diagnose people through, machine learning and that kind of stuff. If that actually ends up happening in the next 20, 30 years, and we have, a robot that we consult with, would that actually solve the problem? Because, like, the robot isn't sinning if it's able to refer someone? What if it was a government company?
That hired employees that could.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so that is an interesting question, and yeah, so basically, like, obviously, whether it's a corporation, the legal entity of a corporation, like, it doesn't have its own beliefs, it can't be sincere about anything, and if we're saying that religious freedom is based upon, well, the sincerity of belief, well, then it's pretty trite to say that I think a corporation of itself can't, let alone like a brick and mortar building. So that is a starting point. But yeah, you're making a good point in terms of, well, does this hospital actually have some sort of faith community around it that would then imbue it with a religious purpose? Like for example, like a Catholic school would, or another claim that was made to the Supreme Court was a community of Hutterian brethren in rural Alberta. So how the courts have treated this is simply to say, well, like the individual Hutterian brethren would have a claim under the charter for X religious freedom. So we're just simply going to treat it as an aggregation of their individual claims. So it works in that setting. It works, for example, for other religious institutions like Catholic schools or Trinity Western University here in BC. So they're an evangelical private university. And the courts have essentially said, yeah, you know what, you have a faith community. Education, promoting and promulgating your faith is a huge part of your community. So we're going to treat this entity essentially like as an expression of that. We're not going to say the university or the school itself or the corporation has beliefs, but we're saying that there's a sufficient religious and faith-based community around it. My point with St. Paul's Hospital is that it's not really clear what that faith community is, right? So we have these controlling minds, which are like the Archdiocese of Vancouver, but they're part of the umbrella organization. They're not the doctors administering MAID, they're not the nurses administering MAID, they're not the patients that are asking to receive MAID or the families of the patients asking to receive MAID. So it's a really remote connection to an actual human that shares and has these religious beliefs. And again, surrounding it, so like the employees aren't necessarily Catholic, the patients aren't necessarily Catholic, so it's hard to say what the faith community around St. Paul's is, right? Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead. No, it's a good discussion, yeah.
Okay. So that's super interesting. So what you were saying is like the Hutterite community or whatever would be treated as a religious group, and
Yeah.
basically, like, fine, we're not going to force you to, like, you know, do MAID or whatever, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So
Yeah, but where the Catholic is like, you guys, like, this is too diffuse of like a entity for us to be able to say. And so I guess what I'm wondering
Yeah.
then, it comes down to like kind of how you define religion then, right? Too, like where like certain religions then, like we're starting with this definition of religion, but like certain religions have, like for instance, yeah, I think a lot of Catholics are, maybe they're saying like, yeah, I'm like, you know, culturally Catholic or whatever, but like it's not like they are super strict about everything they do or they believe, and yet they would still call themselves Catholic. I don't know, I'm just sort of like riffing here. How does that, it seems like there's something in the definition of religion that like could be complicated.
yeah, I think, yeah, I haven't grappled with the AI, I haven't AI bits, I haven't really grappled with what, like more broadly, even broader scope, like, whoa. So we're saying that a religion, to be protected under the charter, you have to have some sort of belief with a nexus to religion. I haven't really grappled with what the question of religion could be. Yeah, I think I've really focused on, like, is there a human being here that can actually, well, believe, to then believe in something, right? So, no, but that's an interesting question, and it actually goes to, well, yeah, well, what's the scope of the charter in terms of protecting what a religion can be, and it actually comes up in the case of in indigenous modes of thought and indigenous beliefs. I won't go into it, but yeah, it's come up in the courts before, yeah. Kayla?
I don't know if my question will be clear, but it was just coming to mind as I was listening to you. So in Quebec, there was the Bill 21 that you probably know of the secular and the you can't wear any religious symbols
Yeah.
in public government jobs.
Yeah.
And to enforce that law, they used the notwithstanding clause.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that clause could be used within a specific hospital setting, since it's funded by the government.
That's a great question.
What is it?
What was the
Okay, so for context, yeah, so great question, Kayla. Actually, you put me on the spot. I haven't really thought about that, but yeah, that's really interesting. So the notwithstanding clause is essentially certain sections of the charter, including Section 2A, so freedom of religion, the government can essentially pass a law that says, notwithstanding the charter, we're passing this law. So it can be a law that notwithstanding the charter can infringe people's freedom of religion, and the court essentially has nothing to, can say nothing about it. And the sort of the democratic limits then on that are every 5 years, it has to come up for debate in Parliament or the provincial legislature, and it has to be voted on again. So that's the sort of democratic limit on this sort of really expansive power that, as an aside, is now being used in really petty ways in provincial politics, which is, yeah, Quebec and also the Ontario government where, yeah. But yeah, just be mindful, Canadian voters, a really unsexy issue, but really prominent and coming up again. So yeah, that's a great point. So yeah, I guess I could see a situation where the government says, you know what, yeah, we're providing a religious exemption for this hospital, and we're saying that it's notwithstanding other folks' Section 2A rights. So essentially, we're immunizing the hospital from the application of state neutrality. I could see that happen, honestly. Yeah, that's a great point, actually. I'm sorry, like I haven't given that much thought, but it's such a great question, so I might have to come back to that one. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, Michael.
I was going to ask you what is the most compelling argument in international politics to say that they should be able to such.
Yeah, so I think the most compelling argument is probably not one that's legal so much as it is practical in terms of, well, St. Paul's is putting, like the Archdiocese is putting quite a bit of money into St. Paul's. It's not just public money being funneled into the public hospital. So they could just say, you know what, well then we're out of the healthcare business, and province, you now have to run St. Paul's all on your own and pony up all the costs of that. And then, well, what's that going to do to the provision of healthcare in a lot of provinces, in particular, for example, Alberta, where I believe the majority of healthcare services are provided by these sorts of faith-influenced hospitals. So that's probably the strongest argument for allowing the sort of balancing of interests. In terms of the legal arguments, I think that they could just, I think it would be founded in terms of, well, isn't this sort of an imposition then of secular values onto us, a Catholic entity? We don't share these secular values that MAID is lawful, moral. And government, by doing this, you're actually imposing that belief on us. And is that something that we want in a Canadian plural society? Or should we, as a government and as a public, ensure that religious communities have broad participation in the public sphere and aren't essentially excluded from providing something that's really valuable to their faith, which is healthcare services to the public? So I think that would be probably the most compelling framing of the hospital's argument. I think that I get around that by saying, well, you're a hospital, you don't have a section, you don't have religious freedom anyways, so what are you arguing? And you're the government, you don't have Section 2A freedoms anyway, so what are you arguing? But yeah, I think that beyond the law, I think that would be two really strong arguments that could be made. Yeah, no, of course. No, I think we're coming up on the hour, so that was a really great discussion, folks. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for coming.